All right, so I'm doing a video just because I feel like I'm supposed to be doing a video, but I don't even know what I want to talk about. We talked about Martin Luther last time. I think what I'll do, your book does a really good job of going into the doctrinal issues, and I think for me to cover all of the doctrinal issues would just be kind of strange. I think it would be a lot. So I think I'll just talk about the main reformers. So Luther is, of course, the big one. I know Erasmus. Erasmus is not. He's not a Protestant reformer. Let me just say this for a second. The word Protestant comes from a group of Lutherans who were protesting the decision of Charles V. It was either 1527 or 1529. Charles V, it was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he made deals with the Lutheran princes because he had to worry about the Turks. And whenever that would subside, then he would turn against the Lutheran princes. So basically he was going against what he had promised earlier, and they protested. That's where Protestant comes from. For purposes in this class, Protestant is basically any group that is not Eastern Orthodox or Catholic. Some people get into fine-tuning and they're like, the Anabaptists aren't Protestants. I just throw everybody in the same boat. So let me talk a little bit about Erasmus. I like Erasmus because he's peaceful. I enjoy the people in history who are trying to bridge gaps. Erasmus is one. Philip Melanchthon, who was Martin Luther's right-hand man, is another one. And so is Martin Bucer, who is impacted by Luther and becomes one of the, if not the first, Reformed reformer. So just so you know terms, Lutheran are those who hold to Lutheran doctrine. Reformed is a type of theology that comes through people like Martin Bucer and Ulrich Zwingli, and then in Calvin. And those are still around today. You have Lutherans. Their theology looks a lot different than Luther, depending on the denomination. We still have Reformed. And in some circles, Reformed is making a comeback, especially in Baptist circles. So, but we dealt with that already. Now, I don't know where my camera, I'm trying to figure out how to look at the camera and which one's better. Sorry. I don't know. Like, I don't know where to look, so I'm like not looking at the actual there. Am I looking at there? Anyway. Ulrich Zwingli is born in Switzerland, and he is he becomes a priest. And while he's a priest, he starts to doubt, or he gets frustrated at the role that the Swiss have in wars. So if you're familiar at all with European history, right, the Swiss were very good mercenaries. The fact that you can buy a Swiss Army knife and the Switzerland doesn't even have an army, a standing army, might seem strange to you, but that's because they were known as phenomenal soldiers. And they would get hired out by, let's say, the Pope, and they would get hired out by, let's say, the King of France, and then they'd fight each other. So you would actually have Swiss soldiers on both sides fighting each other. And Zwingli was like, why are our own Swiss killing the other Swiss? Like, this is absurd. And he started to oppose this. And then he started to oppose, he got hold of a Greek New Testament from Erasmus. Now, Erasmus, his Greek New Testament is one of the most important things, I can't think of a better word, in the Middle Ages. I think I mentioned before how as the Turks came up through Greece, well, actually they took Constantinople, Eastern scholars brought with them manuscripts, Greek in particular, and the Renaissance people started to compare these to the Latin they had and realized the Latin version is not as accurate as the Greek one. And so Erasmus was putting together a Greek New Testament to become a formal text. It's called the TR, the Textus Receptus. It is still used today for comparisons. It's sort of like if you ever were to read Roland Bainton's Here I Stand biography of Martin Luther. That's kind of the standard by which all other biographies are measured. Even if they're better than that, that's still the measure. Same with I would even say something like J.N.D. Kelly that most of you read last term. That's kind of a standard for early church doctrinal work, and everything will be judged against that. So the Textus Receptus is the Greek he compiled, and there are some versions that are better, and but that's the one that you measure it by and say, okay, it's better in these places, whatever. Anyway, once Erasmus got that out onto the printing press and people started reading it, it revolutionized doctrine, because instead of relying on the church telling you what to do based on the Vulgate, you had the Greek, which was more authoritative than the Vulgate. So Erasmus reads it himself, and he starts to turn against a lot of Catholic doctrine. And so he becomes the preacher in Zurich, and while he's there, the way that the town Zurich worked is they have a town council. And one thing you have to understand is in the Middle Ages, Europe is a weird place. So, for example, the Holy Roman Empire is a collection of, and I think I said this before, right? I did with talking about indulgences. It's almost as if you took every state in the country and every county in the country and made them pseudo-independent. So every governor ruled over an area, counts did, dukes did. And so every town kind of had its own thing. It might have a prince, it might have a different ruler, and all of them fell under the jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Emperor, but very loosely. There were some lands that the Holy Roman Emperor controlled directly because of family ties. So Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, controls the Netherlands and Spain. So Charles V is arguably the most powerful Holy Roman Emperor ever. He certainly is very powerful. I like Charles V because he was a devout Catholic, had standards and principles that he operated by. So in Zurich, they had a lot of independence, and the town council determined what went on in the town. And so the town council liked Zwingli as preacher, and there was an event called the Affair of the Sausages, in which during Lent, he told miners, it's a mining town, they could go ahead and eat sausages, because during Lent you're supposed to abstain from that. Because he's like, the rich people can buy fish that you're allowed to eat at Lent, and they can have nourishment, but these miners are stuck eating carrots and celery, and they don't have the means to have energy to go and do their work. Eat the sausages. And he got in trouble. Now, you also have to remember that the Roman Catholic Church has limited power in what goes on in these places. As we saw with Luther, Luther had the protection of Frederick, and so the Catholic Church couldn't just walk in and take him. And so here, Zwingli has a lot of autonomy, and the town council likes him. He starts preaching from the Greek New Testament. He's preaching in German. Zurich is a German-speaking city in Switzerland. And he just starts in Matthew and starts reading through, which is not how the Catholic Church said you were supposed to do it. The way the Catholic Church operates is you, over time, get through the whole Bible, but you read it in parts. So you might have a Mass, and we're going to read Matthew 13, 1 through 5, Psalm 28, James 1, 1 through 5, and Deuteronomy 17, 9 through 20. Well, over the course of a year, you get through the whole Bible if you go to all of the Masses, but it's not in a kind of coherent way that you would think about today if you grow up in a Protestant church. So Zwingli just said, look, the books of the Bible are supposed to be preached as books of the Bible. The Bible's supposed to be preached as a whole. We're just going to go right through this. And he was a great preacher. And so eventually he caught flack with Catholic authorities, and they sent a Catholic to go debate him. And Zwingli came up with what are called his 67 articles. So if you've ever read Martin Luther's 95 Theses, it's a strange work. It has much more in line with scholasticism than humanism. And I know you read about that in McGrath. Humanism, and we're not talking secular humanism, all right? Secular humanism is an atheist philosophical movement that developed in the 20th century. Humanism is an emphasis on getting back to looking at things as they were originally meant to be looked at. The Bible's meant to be read as the Bible, not as piecemeal, things like that. So if you read Martin Luther's 95 Theses, I had a student one time said it's almost like you took paragraphs and just made each sentence a point. because it's just some of the points are somewhat transitional. And the main point of Luther's 95 theses is to argue that the indulgences cannot affect people that are in purgatory, and the Pope would not approve this. So it's great to read, but some of them, if you read Zwingli's 67 articles, you'll be like, oh, this makes sense. Zwingli's 67 articles, if you are a Protestant, if you've grown up in a Bible-believing gospel church, you read his 67 articles, they are spot on, focusing on the need for the gospel, the fact that the gospel alone saves people, the role of Scripture. It is really a fantastic list, and it shows where he stands. And this is in the, I apologize, 1520s. This is maybe 1522 to 1523. I think it's in that time. Zwingli's operating a couple years after Luther. All right, Zwingli's really starting to do his stuff around 1519. Luther's 1517. And he's heard of Luther, but it's not, you can't draw a direct connection. You can't say Zwingli is just taking Luther to the next step. There's a lot of things happening at this time that they're operating independent of each other. Because once Luther starts the process, it allows everybody else to say, hey, wait a second, I can read the Bible for myself. So it's not so much that people are like, I'm going to, and I mean, they would have read Luther, or at least many of them would have, but it's the spirit of the day, which is we're against Catholic corruption. We now have a Greek New Testament that we can read. What is up with what the church is doing? So when you look at Zwingli and Luther's theology, they're different, which is why it's not this genetic connection of Luther to Zwingli. And you're going to see the same with Martin Bucer. Martin Bucer is directly impacted by Luther because Martin Bucer hears Luther speak at the Heidelberg, the Diet of Heidelberg. He's actually there. He's influenced by him. But his theology is much more like Zwingli than it's going to be like Luther. So a couple of things we'll talk about with Zwingli. Just to finish telling his story, basically the town council elects him as their town preacher, and they basically follow Zwingli's lead. A major event that I need to deal with Zwingli, is the Anabaptists. So I mentioned in a previous lecture that I do not look at modern Baptists and see the connection to the Anabaptists. Kind of like my view of Zwingli and Luther, the Baptists come up with their views independent of the Anabaptists. They just have a lot in common. So the Anabaptists start as students of Zwingli. So Zwingli's basically the preacher for Zurich, very important figure in the town council. Again, he's not a dictator. He would be kind of like the president, where the president has limited power. The town council has a lot of power. So if Zwingli were to oppose the town council, he'd be kicked out. And we have to keep that in mind. That'll be really important. So he has students and he's teaching them. What are we going to base our theology on? On the Bible. That's why we can go against the Catholic Church. As these students are reading the Bible in Greek, they're like, you know what? They're like, I don't think baptism is supposed to be done on infants. In case you're not aware, infant baptism had been going on in both Eastern and the Western Church. In the Western Church since the 200s, since the 3rd century. In the Eastern Church, not as sure. I know that maybe by the 4th century, maybe even earlier. I'm not so sure. So I don't know that for sure. I'm guessing on that. The Western Church, for sure, by the middle of the 3rd century, it's becoming an issue. And so by Augustine's time in 400, infant baptism is standard. So for a good 1100, 1200 years, the Roman Catholics have been baptizing infants. And this has political ramifications. When you are baptized, you are entering into Western Europe, Christendom. So if you ever go back prior to the 1500s, right, you find out genealogical information by baptismal records, right? Because it'll say this is when they were baptized. It gives their date, so you know when they were born. And the problem is these Anabaptists, in particular, Conrad Grebel, Felix Mons, and George Blaurock are the 3 main guys at this point. They're like, we don't see this in Scripture, right? It seems to me like everybody that's getting baptized in Scripture is coming of their own volition, starting with John the Baptist, right? Infants aren't being baptized. How can an infant go and repent? John the Baptist is telling people to repent. How can an infant do this? When the Ethiopian eunuch comes with Philip, right? There's no little infants coming. Like throughout all of this time, we don't see infants getting baptized. And it seems that Zwingli is like, you're right. All right. And then Zwingli, it appears when he goes to the town council, they're like, we're having none of that. We're not getting rid of that. And then Zwingli, realizing, in order for the Reformation to continue, I'm not going to go down that road. And he opposes infant baptism, which is going to lead those three and their followers to see Zwingli as a false prophet. You taught us to base our theology on the Bible alone. We show you this, and then you turn against us. You're a hypocrite. All right, so that's going to be a problem. Other issues with infant baptism is, and this is from my professor, Dr. Hammett, who said, he said when he's looking at Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, he says, I think it's just a situation where Europe had been baptizing infants for so long that it's like your context does not allow you to get rid of that. I try to think of examples to use today. In some sense, I look at it like getting a social security number. If you were to tell the government, no social security number for me, they'd be like, you can't do that. You have to have a social security number. Like, how else can we keep track of you? And for Europe, you have to be baptized as an infant. That makes you a citizen. How else are we going to keep track? How are you going to fulfill your civic duty? How are you going to be in the military? Right? You can't just say you're not going to get baptized. The other way I kind of look at it is a lot of churches, less and less, but a lot of churches historically in the U.S. will have a U.S. flag in the sanctuary. All right? And you can go through the Bible and be like, I don't know. I mean, which again, I'm not really making a statement on that. I'm just saying, think of a Chinese church having a Chinese flag in their sanctuary, right? I don't look at the early Christians as having a Roman standard in their church. So, but if you were to tell people, I don't think that having an American flag in the church is biblical, they'd be like, what? We're having an American flag, right? And again, I'm not weighing in on that. I'm just saying that's certainly a route you could take. So these people oppose infant baptism, and they are exiled, but they keep coming back. So I kind of take a hard stance on the Anabaptists because they get persecuted, and in a lot of cases, they kind of bring it on themselves. The way I look at it is, imagine you're an Auburn fan and you hate Alabama. You used to be an Alabama fan, now you're an Auburn fan, and you go to Alabama tailgates and tell people how bad Alabama is. Probably not going to end well for you, right? I mean, so the Anabaptists, which Anabaptist just means baptize again. They denied that because they were like, we were never baptized as infants because baptism has to be of your own volition. That doesn't count. So Anabaptist is a name of where you're arguing against them, right? You're like, oh, you're just getting rebaptized. They would say, we were never baptized at first. So they continue to argue and rant against Zwingli. They go in to knock over the baptismal font. So they don't make themselves very winsome. Now, we're going to have some Anabaptists that are just minding their own business and get tortured mercilessly and executed. But here, and again, this is probably Olson's bias, so don't take this as gospel truth. Read it on your own. But you read it and you're going, why you gotta be so jerky about it? Like, you're in their face with your views. No wonder you got put in prison and then eventually executed. Not all of them. I'm trying to think. One of them was executed. Another one died of I forget. I forget what they died of. They died of a disease. And the other one, I think, died as well. I'm trying to remember if only one or several were. You should expect more from your church history professor, right? You should expect that I would know more about this, but I haven't looked at that in a year. I should brush up on that. But anyway, they, needless to say, all three of them die young. One way that Anabaptists were often killed is by drowning, because they said, oh, you want to be baptized again? We'll baptize you, right? And so they would drown them, which was kind of an ironic way to kill them. So Zwingli is where the Anabaptists come from. He is not an Anabaptist, but that's where they originate. So jumping back to Zwingli's theology for a minute. Zwingli, let's look at his view of church and state. If we look at Luther's view of church and state was one where they should work together. That was the Roman Catholic view with the Holy Roman Empire. The church should be concerned about spiritual matters, and the state should carry out civic things. For Zwingli, and this will be true with Calvin, and you see it in the Puritans, right? The Puritans in Massachusetts and in England is the clearest example of Zwingli and Calvin's ecclesiology being lived out. So they made it where the church and state worked together. So the church figures would have a very important political role. So for Luther, you would say his view of government is you have two hands and hey, look, I can do two different things at once, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Each has a sphere of influence. My wife's texting me. Oh, sorry. And for Zwingli and Calvin and the Puritans, the church and state are hand in glove. So they are doing the same thing. It's as close to a theocracy as you're going to see, all right, where they are supposed to be intertwined. So a lot of people think that the medieval times that the Catholic Church was a kind of theocracy. It wasn't, right? It was working with the state. They should both have the same goal in mind, but they had different spheres. For Zwingli, Calvin, they're supposed to do, the church is involved in the government and it should motivate the government to do things. Not like we would argue today where you vote for somebody, but much more where we are going to, as these civil figures, carry out biblical things. All right? What the Bible tells us to do. So that's one of Zwingli's main differences with Luther and with the Anabaptists. We're going to see with the Anabaptists, their view is church and state should be completely separated, completely. We'll talk about them later. So the other thing with Zwingli is, and this is a major difference between Luther and Zwingli, is I think a very fun episode, is in 1529 with the whole Charles V, who's always concerned with the Turks. So if you look at a map of Europe, the Turks have come up through the Balkans and they're on the door. Austria, Hungary, right there, all right there. And so they're clear and present danger to Western Europe. They'll call them the Turk. Lots of times Muslims will just be called Turks. Roger Williams, who is the founder of Rhode Island, who is one of the first who believes in complete freedom of religion, he even says that Rhode Island would welcome the Jew and the Turk, which is Muslims, right? Because the only Muslims they know are Turks. So when Charles V, whenever the Turks are looking somewhere else, Charles V, as I mentioned earlier, turns against the Protestants to try to get them under Catholic control. So you have Lutheran princes, which are in Germany, and you start to have some Reformed cantons. Cantons are like counties in Switzerland, like states. So the Protestant princes want to join forces with the Reformed cantons to have a unified front for if Charles V attacks. And so to do this, they get together Lutheran theologians and Reformed theologians. Now, Calvin doesn't enter the picture yet. Calvin doesn't come into the picture till 1539. All right, Zwingli will have been dead for 8 years by then. So Calvin's not involved in this. So if you're familiar with John Calvin, he's not in the picture yet. So at this debate, you have people like Philip Melanchthon, who's Lutheran. You have Martin Bucer, who's Reformed. You have people like Oecolampadius, who is Lutheran. And, I got to think of the guy who's Reformed. Anyway, all these theologians who argue, I think Oecolampadius is Lutheran. He could be Reformed. I really think he's Lutheran. They get together and they draw up 15 points of discussion theologically, and they agree on 14 of the 15. The one they do not agree on is the Lord's Supper. All right, Lutherans and Reformed both believe in infant baptism. Both believe in predestination. All right, Zwingli, Calvin, they are Augustinian predestination like Luther. In fact, Calvin will go further and support double predestination. So the one thing they can't agree on is the Lord's Supper, and Luther and Zwingli are the last. They're going at it on this matter. And for Luther, infant baptism, the Lord's Supper, I think from just having been a Catholic priest and doing the Mass was such a huge event for him that he could not get past the idea that somehow Jesus is present in the bread and the wine. So he did not believe in transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is the Catholic view that's really developed in the 1200s that says that when the priest says the words of consecration, the bread and the wine physically become the body and blood of Christ. In smell, not in smell, not in taste, but in actuality becomes the body and blood of Christ. It's a renewed sacrifice. Luther doesn't agree with that. He's like, that's too scientific. You've reduced this mystery to science. That's not it. So Luther believed that somehow Christ was present physically, but it wasn't like he became it. And Zwingli's like, that's absurd. It's just symbolic. And Luther was like, what does it say when Jesus said at the Last Supper? This is my body. And Zwingli's like, right, but Jesus in other places says he's the gate. Is Jesus just a big gate? And Luther would be, oh, you're just being silly. They could not get past this issue. On the last day of the debate, Luther had scrawled in chalk on the table, this is my body. And when he was arguing for the physical presence of Christ, he rips off the tablecloth and starts banging on the table, right? This is my body. And they cannot come to an agreement. Zwingli's just flustered because he's like, I don't get how you can have such a great man who can't understand this is symbolic. So Zwingli's view of the Lord's Supper is what most Baptists have today, right? Most Baptists will believe that the Lord's Supper, it's just symbolic, all right? Zwingli is really one of the first ones that's going to argue that. Calvin believes that there's a spiritual presence. Somehow Christ is present spiritually. Zwingli's like, nope, it's just a symbol. So because of that division, they cannot come to this conclusion. And then in 1531, Zurich is attacked and Zwingli is killed in battle. He's a chaplain and he's killed. And Luther's like, yep, serves him right, live by the sword, die by the sword. Like Luther has no time for it. For Luther, amazingly, this was akin to heresy. Luther had more in common with the Catholics on the Lord's Supper than Zwingli. For the Catholics, he's like, you're just wrong, but it's not heretical. Zwingli, you're a heretic. So, I mean, Luther had no time for him. And I've mentioned before, Martin Luther is, to me, the most entertaining person in church history. He is just fun because, and again, I use examples, and I don't mean this in a positive or negative way. If you've ever seen, but like, if Martin Luther had a Twitter account, wow, like he would have some of the best scriptural analysis and some of the worst things ever. I mean, you can just see him just calling people out, right? Just if you look at Donald Trump's Twitter account, I'm like, yeah, it's probably Martin Luther. Like, they would just be like, boom, I'm right, you're wrong, blah, and just dump garbage on the person, right? I mean, just totally like vomit at the mouth on them. So anyway, that's Zwingli. And the problem that we have with Zwingli is he doesn't have, we call him a first generation reformer. Luther, Zwingli are first generation reformers. That means, and the Anabaptists too, that means they are the ones who are plowing the field. And they aren't the ones who are planting the field. And what I mean by that is, when you read Martin Luther is constantly putting out fires. Zwingli is constantly explaining himself and putting out fires. Neither one of them really had a complete systematic theology. Certainly not Luther. Zwingli comes up with a little bit that's close to it. Calvin is a second generation reformer. And John Calvin will have the time to sit down and really think through his theology, which will come to us in the Institutes. So I'll stop here. That's Zwingli. And then I need to do one on the Anabaptist and one on Calvin. And again, if you people are bored, you can just skip these. This is just if you want to watch them.